explain a lifetime of demonic harassment, and even if he could, he didn't think this was the time or the place. "It's nothing," I was startled by something. Was his answer, before closing the door and staring down the beast, who simply stared back with beady eyes. Again, there was no real confrontation. It was like having a conversation with a car dealer once more, as the white man tried to make his deal. This thing was here to collect interest, but wanted to offer last year's chance once more. Again, remember, my father was not a bright man, and it took him a moment to understand what the white man meant. Once the image clicked into his mind, the white man echoed it, as if to confirm. 2 boys for 2 boys. If he offered his own unborn sons, the white man would finally consider his infelice debt paid. It was that simple, but my father continued to refuse. He would not offer his sons up as a substitute, and that was final. There was one last push for it before the white man gave up. There was no confrontation, although my father always used to add, "I would have fought them if I had to." Fortunately though, he didn't have to. The white man simply slid away from under the car and into the white of the snow without anyone ever noticing. You must be asking, of course, what my mother thought happened. My mother simply thought that snow had gotten the car stuck and that my father got the car free somehow. If there was a giant monster, she never saw it. He got back in the car, drove her to the hospital, and she had 2 healthy boys, of which I was the slightly older, despite us being 3 to 4 weeks early. We were a bit small, but not sickly. I'm sure you thought this would have a more dramatic conclusion, but it didn't. There wasn't one. But, if you've been paying attention, you probably noticed something as well. I've mentioned a younger sister, but never a brother. Before anyone asks, my slightly younger twin brother didn't somehow become my sister, either. Everything went relatively well, although my brother and I remained in the hospital a few days longer than usual to monitor for any health problems. The next month, things continued to go well, although my father acted more nervous than usual during the winter months. If the white man had shown such interest in us, why had it suddenly disappeared? Why had it taken nothing else? There hadn't even been any missing persons, which seemed to occasionally subside its hunger and the curse. It was the middle of February when things came to a head. Ironically, perhaps, it was on the day my brother and I were expected to be born on initially. My brother and I shared a room, although we had different cribs. My mother was not a champion caregiver, and my father most frequently cared for us. So when I began crying loudly in the middle of the night, it wasn't who came to see what I wanted, and it wasn't who discovered the window beside my brother's crib open. No, he wasn't missing. He wasn't gone like the pigs or the dog or my uncle who drove off the road into a lake. They didn't put out missing posters like they did for the poor man who tried to help a 16-year-old version of my father after he drove off the road. Instead, he was simply dead. A cold body in a cold crib in a room much too cold for babies. The official cause of death was sudden infant death syndrome, although I'm sure it could have been something else had my parents not closed the window before the paramedics arrived. My father's logic with the white man was often faulty. Why did the white man sometimes leave bodies my brothers, grandfathers, and other times not? Not to mention, there's the logic holes some of you have pointed out. Why didn't he just go back on his deal? Why didn't he take 2 boys and everyone else? Who knows, really? My father never had an answer for it either, but it was clear to him that since no one else died, it was that year's interest. Now I want to say one more thing, before I move on to the next part here. My mother was not a good mother, at least not until I got somewhat older. She loved me, I'm sure, and she was certainly my favorite parent. We simply had closer interests and better conversations, but she was not a good mother when I was an infant. She hated babies, she wasn't crazy about children, and she would have not had kids if it had been her choice alone. She suffered badly from postpartum depression, which didn't clear up entirely until my sister was about 3. With that in mind, I want to note that she was the last one to care for my brother and I before going to sleep. Of course, it sounds like I straight up blame my mother for that one. I don't, entirely. I think it could have been some accident on my father's part, or some half-hearted kidnapping attempt, or who knows what. I just always thought it was a possibility, and I believe my father knew that as well. My uncle never knew of the window. My grandparents never knew. Only myself, my mother, my sister, and my father ever knew the window was open, and only because my idiot father left it in the story when he told us. Years later, I asked my mother about it. She confirmed it. She confirmed they closed it before help arrived to make things look less irresponsible. she asked me to never tell anyone. Despite that major detail being left out of the official account of things, other people had their suspicions too. It's important I tell you that, because the white man was never my excuse for any of these things like it was my father's. It was just a spooky story he'd tell, that I thought other people would enjoy. My grandparents never believed the sudden infant death syndrome story entirely. My father never went to bed without making sure all the windows were locked and we were safe in our beds, not until my sister and I were well past the age that an open window would kill us. After that it was the death of my grandmother, father's side, that my father blamed on the white man. My grandmother, never quite capable of taking care of herself, had wandered off into the woods near her trailer, yet that's where she ended up and wasn't found for 3 days. The official story was that her wood-burning stove in a trailer had run out of wood and she'd gone in to find more and gotten lost. To be honest, considering how my father got as he grew older and suffered a few last shocks, she may have simply been senile or incapable of handling a life without her husband of nearly 30 years. The only time I met my grandmother was at her funeral, when I was barely a year old. There's a picture of us together, taken by my Uncle Philly, with me sitting in the coffin next to her. I came from middle class on that side, you know. The year following, it was my grandmother's other one, the one who is still alive, Scottish Terrier, which wandered out one cold evening and never came back. A missing hunter the next year. An aunt on my father's side again, never met the year after. The aunt's a bit of a fun story, I guess. She just disappeared, and to this day they never have found a body or even evidence of foul play. The popular theory that is, not my father's, is that she got sick of her husband and kids and drove off and didn't come back. Then my sister was born. Another accident. Even after my birth, my parents were told my mother was practically sterile and that it had been a fluke, no need to worry. Well, one accidental pregnancy is a fluke and another is proof your uterus works fine. After she was born, my mother opted to have her tubes tied and end the cycle once and for all. She just really wasn't crazy about kids at all. I'm actually not ever sure she told my father that she did that. Not that it matters anyway. My sister was born in the summer, and unlike with my brother and I, the white man made no effort to make a deal for her soul, perhaps because by time it became winter she was already an amazingly active baby and he didn't want to deal with her any more than my mother did. The next few years' list of collections I don't remember clearly. I probably got a few of the ones prior out of order, to be honest. One year the black borzoi ran off, another my sister's pet cat. Overall though, the next few years of our childhood were relatively drama and monster-free, although my father swore up and down that it was a scheme, that it was all leading up to the big finale. There is no overly happy ending, just a warn. When my sister was 10 and I was almost 15, my mother began drinking heavily. My mother had always liked to drink, had always shown more interest in partying and spending money than working or spending time with her family, and to be honest I didn't see this as an entirely negative trait. I thought it was kind of cool having a mom who would give me a shot of vodka and talk to me about things only adults talked about, which is probably why I preferred my mother so much to my father. She and I were good friends and I loved her dearly, but we didn't have a great relationship as family members. Mom was who you went to if you needed permission to go out and party or wanted someone to buy you something. Dad was who you went to if you actually needed something and had the time to listen to a boring story. This drinking escalated over the course of the summer, and by winter, she was a full-blown alcoholic. I know none of this is really relevant to the story, or at least not spooky, but it's important to know because it's about the line between my father's imagination and probable illusion and reality. My parents' relationship was failing, at least on her end. Her mental stability was failing too, but for a lot of different relationships. And no one saw it. I thought maybe they'd divorce or end up in therapy, although they didn't fight much, so I don't know why that was the conclusion I drew, and my father thought trying to get her to go to church more would help. But no one did much, and so it didn't surprise us when one morning she didn't come home. When she didn't show up from her drinking one cold January morning, the police were called and an investigation begun. It didn't take long for them to reach a probable conclusion. Remember how many years ago, an uncle had driven off the road and into a river? That road was between our house and my grandparents' house, and had once been used frequently. Now it was more of a side road, used less frequently, especially in poor weather. An investigation showed someone had driven off the road once more, but with bad weather rolling in again, they'd be unable to pursue much of an investigation for a bit. Eventually, though, they found my mother's car at the bottom of the river, where her brothers had ended up close to 20 years before. Again, there was no body, just a car, but fish and the current can carry away a lot in just a few months. Case closed, investigation over. Funeral with an empty casket. Motives? Was it an accident? Intentional? No one knew, everyone had their theories. To be honest, I feel it probably was an accident and she was simply a bad drunk driver. My father, of course, knew what had really happened and told my sister and I once. It was the interest for that year. He'd seen the white man since then. It was enough though, and the contract was almost up, so we would not need to worry so much anymore. After that, my father spoke less of the white man, mentioning him only when prompted. In general, that was how he behaved most of the time though. He spoke less, talking only when prompted. He had spent close to 20 years taking care of my mother, even when she didn't need it, and he had spent most of his life worrying about some boogeyman. Now his children were almost adults, he was mostly alone, and he was less and less needed. Without someone to take care of, he couldn't take care of himself either, much like how his mother had ended up. Until I left at 18, I drove him places and helped him with things he could no longer do. It wasn't that he was senile, exactly, for he wasn't old, it was just that he couldn't do it. Something left him, and he needed help. Every year, winter still scared him and he still wouldn't go outside, but he was less nervous and almost bitter during those months. His debt was paid, I think he thought. When I left, my sister began caring for him. We weren't close, my sister and I were my father and I, as I've said, so I didn't check in much and I didn't visit at all. My uncle Philly moved nearer to the area after his own lifetime of bad luck, which brought some pep back to my father, at least so I heard, and gave him a proper babysitter. This of course all leads us back to the start. On Sunday, he died. I wish I could say it was something dramatic, like the house was torn up by a Yeti and they never found his body, but it wasn't. My father did not drive well in the snow, and my sister wasn't home to drive him. He went out to the store that night, slid off the road going too fast, and wasn't found until morning, by which time he had died from his injuries and shock. We buried him fast, and I saw my sister for the first time in 4 years. My father looked much older than 54 in his coffin. I remembered how old my grandmother looked from pictures when she was his age, how old she looked in her coffin that I once laid inside. My family doesn't age well, I guess. Is there some plot twist to this all? No. But there's one more piece of information, and I've been saving it for the dramatic end. Philly's saying things are looking in his windows. That he's hearing someone stomp around his house at night and catching glimpses of movement from outside, but when he goes out there, he can't even find any footprints.
Most conspiracy theories, especially the crazier ones, are meant to discredit the real ones. 1 hour of disturbing, creepy and interesting conspiracy theories. I think some memes are started by businesses as a form of free advertising. The recent Duolingo memes got me thinking more about it. Duolingo wasn't a small app at the time, but it became a lot more popular after the fact. There have been other memes revolving around a particular product or brand as well, that make me think this is happening on a strategic level beyond some kid thinking it'd be hella funny to do this or that. Marshmello doesn't actually produce his own music. My biggest piece of evidence is the creator Arcade Videos. He speaks and navigates Ableton like someone with only a basic knowledge of music production. He does everything number by number. Producers don't do that. You can't just instantly know that sound needs a boost of exactly 1 dB at exactly 1.2 kHz without even listening to the sound first. He randomly pauses every now and then, presumably to be fed lines. And he seems to lack even a basic understanding of music theory, recreating MIDI by randomly clicking in notes with no regard for the